Good evening. The motion before us, Norman Borlaug's high-yield wheat varieties, fed 1 billion people who would otherwise have starved between 1960 and 1990. The Green Revolution bought the demographic transition time to work. It also created monoculture agriculture dependent on chemical inputs, reduced crop genetic diversity to a dangerous degree, and increased groundwater depletion in regions that cannot sustain it. It saved the world from a Malthusian catastrophe and created the conditions for the next one. At the table, 3 minds approaching this from different angles of inquiry. The empiricist tests every causal claim against the structure of evidence, distinguishing what we know from what we assume, and refusing to accept explanations that are untestable in principle. The geographer thinks in landscapes, populations, and the material facts of soil, water, and distance, placing every abstraction back onto the ground where actual people must live with the consequences. The essayist watches what millions of human beings actually do when systems change beneath them, the gap between institutional design and lived behavior, between what a policy intends and what it produces in practice. What is at stake is not merely historical assessment. We are speaking from inside 2020. The climate is changing the parameters. The aquifers are lower, the topsoil is thinner, and there are 8 billion of us. The question is whether the rescue that worked becomes, by its very success, the shape of the trap we are now in, and whether a civilization can see that while it is happening. Empiricist, you open.
The motion before us commits what philosophers call a category error, dressed as historical fact. It treats a counterfactual, 1 billion people who would otherwise have starved, as if it were an observation, when it is actually a model assumption that can never be verified. Here is what we know. India's wheat production in 1960, 11 million tons. By 1970, 20 million. By 1990, 55 million. Pakistan's wheat yield per hectare doubled between 1965 and 1980. Mexico, where Borlaug worked from 1944, became a wheat exporter by 1963, having been an importer since records began. These are measurements. What we do not know, cannot know, is what would have happened absent the intervention. The claim of 1 billion saved requires a baseline catastrophe that we can never observe because it did not occur. Every estimate I have examined constructs this baseline by assuming constant yields, constant acreage, and no alternative technological or institutional response. That is not a conservative assumption. That is a null hypothesis masquerading as inevitability. The buried dependency here is instructive. Those baseline projections assume that irrigated wheat farming would have absorbed no additional labor-saving mechanization, no expansion of pulse cultivation in rain-fed zones, no reallocation of colonial-era cash crop acreage. Strip those assumptions out and the projected death toll contracts dramatically. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed approximately 3 million people. It occurred during years of adequate aggregate harvest in India. Amartya Sen demonstrated that famines in the 20th century were not caused by aggregate food shortage, but by failures of entitlement and distribution. The Irish famine, the Soviet famines, the Chinese famine of 1959 to 1961, which killed tens of millions, none resulted from absolute production constraints. They resulted from political economy. So the first question is not whether high-yield varieties increased production. They did. The question is whether production constraints were the binding constraint on starvation, or whether we are crediting an agricultural intervention for solving a problem that was fundamentally institutional. Bangladesh, population in 1970, roughly 67 million. Population in 2020, approximately 165 million. Per capita calorie availability in 2020, higher than in 1970 on less arable land per person. That outcome required the Green Revolution and also required fertility to fall from roughly 7 children per woman in 1970 to replacement level by 2020. If fertility had remained at 1970 levels, Bangladesh would now have several hundred million more people, and no amount of wheat breeding would have closed that gap. The rescue was demographic as much as agronomic. The falsifiable claim is this: if high-yield varieties were sufficient to prevent the Malthusian crisis, we should see no correlation between adoption of those varieties and subsequent fertility decline. We see the opposite. The genuine causal story runs through women's education, infant mortality, and urbanization, all of which the production surplus enabled. The wheat bought time. The time had to be used for something else.
The empiricist separates the institutional from the agronomic, and it is an elegant and necessary distinction. But it omits the geology, which is where the bill is kept. The surplus that fed India was not grown everywhere. It came, overwhelmingly, from Punjab and Haryana on less than 5% of the nation's land. This was a deliberate geopolitical strategy designed in the 1960s to create a food buffer after years of crisis. The state guaranteed prices, subsidized electricity for pumps, and provided credit for the new seeds and the chemicals they demanded. This remade the landscape, incentivizing a massive shift to water-intensive rice and wheat, away from traditional millets and pulses that were actually suited to the climate. Consider a farmer, let's call him Jaswinder Singh, in the Sangrur district of Punjab. His grandfather farmed with the monsoon. His father saw the miracle and installed the first shallow tube well in the 1970s. Jaswinder inherited the farm. The water table his father tapped at 20 feet is now below 150. Every few years, he must borrow money to drill a deeper well and install a new submersible pump, a cost that runs into thousands. His personal debt grows not because he is a poor farmer, but because he is a successful one, locked into a system that is literally mining water to feed the cities. His story is the story of his state. According to India's own Central Groundwater Board, the vast majority, more than 3/4 of Punjab's groundwater blocks, are now classified as overexploited. This isn't a problem of distribution between people, as Sen described for Bengal. It is a problem of distribution across time. We ate that wheat. Jaswinder's children will pay for the water. This pattern is familiar from biology. It is the logic of a parasite that keeps its host alive only to consume it more completely. The short-term success guarantees the long-term failure of the system upon which it depends. The empiricist asks the correct question about the counterfactual, but frames it too narrowly. The question is not simply what would have happened without the wheat. It is, what was the full cost of that wheat? The accounts were kept in the wrong ledger. The profits were posted to the nation's grain reserves, while the costs were debited to the aquifers beneath one man's fields. The famine was not averted. It was merely buried.
The two positions share an assumption that has not been examined, that population growth remains the primary pressure to be managed, and that households will continue to treat children as the default response to any margin of food security. The data on actual behavior shows the opposite. Across the lower middle-income countries that adopted the new cereal varieties earliest, total fertility has fallen below replacement in urban cohorts and is falling fastest where yield gains were largest. The mechanism is visible in the timing. Once calorie availability per person crossed the threshold that removed chronic undernutrition as a constraint on child survival, parents began reallocating the same resources towards schooling and later marriage rather than additional births. This shift is not a policy outcome. It is a revealed preference visible in marriage registers, school enrollment logs, and contraceptive prevalence surveys. The pattern repeats wherever the same surplus appears, whether the state intended it or not. The historical precedent is the sustained fertility decline that followed the expansion of irrigated rice cultivation in lowland Java and Luzon during the 1950s. As smallholder yields rose and seasonal hunger receded, completed family size across those island provinces dropped from above 6 to below 4 within roughly 2 generations, well ahead of any formal family planning infrastructure reaching those communities. The transition was driven not by instruction, but by incentive. A child who survived reliably became a child whose education carried an opportunity cost. The same sequence is now observable in the districts of northern India and central Mexico that first planted the semi-dwarf varieties. Age at first birth is rising, female labor force participation outside agriculture is rising, and desired family size stated in surveys has converged toward the number of children actually born. These are not elite preferences. They are the aggregate decisions of millions of rural households that now treat an extra child as a net cost rather than an insurance asset. If that behavioral adjustment continues at its present pace, the quantity of staple calories required per capita will keep falling even as total population stabilizes or declines. The remaining constraint is therefore not aggregate production, but the distribution of the income required to purchase a more diversified and less land-intensive diet. That is the margin on which the next scarcity, if it arrives, will actually be decided. You claim that the question is whether production constraints were the binding constraint on starvation, or whether we are crediting an agricultural intervention for solving a problem that was fundamentally institutional. In the Sahel states, where cereal yields rose sharply after 1985, while land tenure and market access stayed fixed, what happened to measured rates of child stunting in the same districts that recorded no rise in school attendance or urban migration?
Stunting rates did fall in the Sahel, even where institutions remained weak. And that concession matters. Calories alone do improve immediate survival outcomes independent of market access, land tenure, or schooling. The essayist is right about that much. But the calibration question being posed is the wrong one. The relevant measure is not whether children in those districts were shorter, but whether their mothers chose to have fewer of them. Across the Sahel states, where cereal availability rose meaningfully in the 1990s and 2000s, fertility declined, but at a pace that lagged far behind the transitions seen where the surplus coincided with girls' secondary schooling or access to wage labor. The production increase bought survival. It did not buy the behavioral shift the essayist is describing as something close to automatic. Bangladesh is instructive here precisely because it allows the variables to be separated. Between 1975 and 1995, rice yields climbed substantially, yet the steepest fertility declines tracked not the harvest curve, but the expansion of the BRAC schooling network and the entry of women into the garment sector. The districts where yield gains arrived without either showed fertility remaining elevated well into the period the essayist treats as one of convergent transition. The demographic response was not latent in the grain. It was latent in what surrounded the grain. So the question that needs an answer is this: what threshold of surplus, absent any accompanying institutional change, actually triggers the fertility response? The essayist claims is revealed preference rather than policy. Name the mechanism, name the threshold. Because without that specification, the argument is not a finding, it is a hope. The Punjab State Electricity Board provides agricultural power at roughly 1 rupee per unit, when the actual supply cost is several times that figure. The gap is not small. The subsidy running to Punjab's agricultural sector through the 2010s was substantial enough that multiple fiscal reviews flagged it as a structural threat to state finances. We are talking about tens of billions of rupees annually by credible estimates. The electricity arrives at close to zero marginal cost for pumping beyond the low fixed charge, which means the farmer extracting water from 400 feet below the water table pays nothing for the last acre-foot or the one after that. You describe the indebted cultivator as the cost of being locked into a system, but that framing obscures where the lock actually sits. It is not in the seed contract or the mandi price. It is in the energy price signal, which has been systematically falsified for decades. Consider the Ogallala Aquifer beneath the American High Plains as the reference case. Irrigated agriculture there expanded for precisely as long as extraction remained cheap relative to the commodity return, and the depletion was only legible in retrospect through bore log records rather than balance sheets. The same logic operates in central Punjab, where depths to the water table have roughly doubled over the past 30 years. Remove the subsidy tomorrow, and farmers face the real cost of lifting water from those depths. At market energy prices and present wheat support prices, a very large share of that acreage becomes uneconomic. The geographer's estimate of perhaps a quarter remaining viable is plausible, possibly generous. The implication is not subtle. What we have here is a system that works like a promissory note drawn on two separate public accounts simultaneously, one at the electricity board, one at the procurement price floor, where the principal is never scheduled for repayment, only rolled forward. A treasury that is continuously issuing bonds to finance its own apparent solvency is not solvent. It is deferring the reckoning. A system that is only solvent because those two public treasuries are simultaneously absorbing losses is not feeding anyone at its own expense. It is mining groundwater and mining public accounts in the same motion, and calling the result a harvest.
You are right to point to the subsidy. It is the engine of the entire apparatus. If it were removed, what percentage of wheat acreage would remain viable? Very little, perhaps a quarter. The energy cost of lifting water from 400 feet makes the entire enterprise uneconomic at market prices. But your question, whether the system is mining water or mining the treasury, presumes the two are separate accounts. They are not. The subsidy is merely the fiscal mechanism for a vast physical transfer of water, embodied in grain, from the geology of one state to secure the political stability of the cities. The true cost is paid elsewhere. Consider Fatuma Warsam, a seed bank curator in the Ethiopian highlands. For 3 decades, she has been attempting to preserve and reintroduce indigenous teff and sorghum varieties among smallholders who abandoned them. She cannot complete that work because development aid flows preferentially toward countries willing to adopt certified high-yield input packages, and her mandate is perpetually underfunded. The institutional incentive is a distortion written by a different geography. So is the cost of that subsidy borne by the Indian Treasury, or is it borne by Fatuma's inability to insure her region against the crop failures that are now, under changing rainfall patterns, a statistical certainty within 2 decades? The essayist, your argument requires a household to see a new and better investment, the educated child who can leave the farm. Let us test that perception on the ground. Consider a tenant farming family in the Bicol region of Luzon, where HYV rice adoption surged after 1972. Yields climbed, but the nearest secondary school sat 3 hours away by jeepney on a road that became impassable between June and October, and the regional cannery, the one employer beyond the paddies, closed before the decade was out. When the geography makes the return on education a fiction, does the rational calculus not default to the old logic? Another pair of hands for the harvest.
The question isolates the precise limit of the mechanism. Where roads and labor markets stayed frozen, fertility fell more slowly than in connected districts, and households did keep an extra child for the harvest. The Delta villages of Irrawaddy, Myanmar in the 1970s illustrate the pattern precisely. Paddy smallholders in flood-isolated townships maintained completed family sizes roughly a full child higher than those within cycling distance of the Rangoon Trunk Road, yet once those same children reached working age, the isolation proved permeable after all, and seasonal migration to urban textile workshops converted the extra pair of hands into a remittance stream rather than a permanent farm asset. The old logic, therefore, does not reassert itself indefinitely. It mutates into circular migration that still reduces completed family size only on a longer timetable.
The question beneath the question is whether a rescue can ever be designed to end, or whether every successful intervention becomes the architecture of permanent dependency that makes the next crisis both inevitable and invisible to those who must navigate it. We are in 2026. The Colorado River Compact was written for a flow that no longer exists. The North China Plain produces a fifth of the nation's grain on aquifers expected to fail within a generation. The Ogallala has dropped 100 feet beneath 500,000 farms that feed 200 million people. We are not approaching the scenario you have been debating. We are inside it. The wheat is in the supermarket. The wells are going dry. The fiscal transfers are enormous and continuous. And yet, the consensus remains that this is somehow a stable equilibrium requiring only better management. So, Are we the kind of people who can see this from inside? Or does the very fact that the system still feeds us prevent us from recognizing that it has already failed?
Success in raising staple yields dissolves the rural population it was designed to keep alive. Where the new varieties first took hold, census records show the share of young adults remaining in agriculture fell by half within 25 years, not because harvests failed, but because the same land now supported fewer hands while still meeting national demand. The surplus was not merely in grain, it was in people, suddenly freed from the constraint that had held them to the soil for 10,000 years. The geographer is right that geography mediates the mechanism. Emilio Vargas's father on Samar, doubling his rice yield on a road that washed out every monsoon, did not send his children to university on the strength of that harvest alone. But he did accumulate an asset. The land became collateral, leverage, the thing you sell or mortgage when the opportunity finally arrives, rather than the thing you subdivide endlessly among sons who have no other option. That shift in how a household conceives of its land is not a minor psychological adjustment. It is the hinge on which demographic history turns. The road matters for pace, the asset matters for direction. The cross-domain pattern that clarifies this is what happened in the English Midlands between roughly 1780 and 1820, when the enclosure movement and selective crop rotation consolidated small holdings before the mill towns of Lancashire had finished building the terraced streets to receive the displaced. The village did not empty because Manchester beckoned. It emptied because the reorganized farm no longer needed the labor it had historically absorbed. The Green Revolution compressed that same sequence into 15 or 20 years across regions that had neither the institutional capacity nor the urban infrastructure industrial England eventually improvised to receive the displaced. The result was not failure. It was a managed dislocation that produced the demographic transition the host describes as the whole point of buying time, arriving fast and unevenly, and leaving behind aquifer debt and monoculture fragility as the invoice. The subsidy structure the debate examined keeps fields producing for distant consumers rather than for those who till them. Yet the households themselves have already voted with their feet, treating the farm as an asset to be managed or sold rather than as the sole source of security for the next generation. That choice, once made, does not reverse. You do not uneducate the child who left, unbuild the remittance habit, unconsolidate the landholding that absorbed the siblings who departed. What remains is the system operating without the demographic pressure it originally answered. Its permanence now rests entirely on whether the remaining operators can extract profit at full input cost once the original political bargain between governments and their rural constituencies finally expires. The host's question was whether any rescue can be designed to end. The honest answer is that this one already ended quietly at the household level sometime in the 1980s and 1990s, district by district, as the last son calculated that wage work paid better than fragmented inheritance. The infrastructure built around that rescue, the subsidies, the aquifer drawdowns, the monoculture supply chains, did not end with it. What that leaves is less a system awaiting reform than a load-bearing wall whose original structure was quietly removed decades ago, the building still standing not from design but from accumulated inertia, waiting for the settlement crack that reveals what has been true for 30 years. That is not a delay of the reckoning. That is the reckoning, already in progress, moving at the speed of geology and hydrology rather than at the speed of politics.
The essayist is correct. The choice made by the household is irreversible. The farm becomes an asset, not a fate. But the story does not end when the farmer's children leave the village. It begins again, somewhere else. The Green Revolution did not merely create a surplus of grain, it created a surplus of people, untethered from the land, who flowed into cities that were unprepared for them. This is not a gradual process. It is a phased transition. A system can absorb stress for decades, appearing stable, until one day a critical threshold is crossed and its entire character changes at once. We are watching that threshold being crossed in the coastal megacities of Asia, which absorbed so much of that initial migration. Consider the trajectory of Makar colony in Karachi itself, a settlement of nearly 1 million people, built on a tidal floodplain without formal title, sanitation, or state services, populated in large part by the grandchildren of tenant farmers in rural Sindh who benefited from the increased wheat yields of the 1970s. That bounty allowed families to grow, and that growth meant the next generation had to leave the land for the city, and the generation after them was born into concrete rooms on subsiding ground they do not own. It is a community whose founding logic was agricultural surplus and whose present reality is coastal inundation. The question was whether we can see the failure from inside. The view from a doorway in that settlement is this. The tide comes in higher each year, creeping further into the alleyways. This is not an abstraction. The Arabian Sea is rising, and the Indus Delta, starved of the very silt that once built it, is subsiding at roughly 6 millimeters per year in some reaches, faster than the global mean sea level rise that compounds it. The surplus grain that fed these families' grandparents was grown with water diverted from the river that should have been replenishing this land. We mistook a geographic transfer for a solution. We moved the water from the river to the fields, and then we moved the people from the fields to the coast. Now the water is coming for the people. The failure is not in the empty wheat field. It is here, in the flooded lane. Where once a farmer read the soil to know his fortune, a third-generation urbanite reads the waterline on the wall of his home, measuring not harvest yields, but the inches by which the sea is reclaiming delta land that was built over millennia by the very river his grandfather's irrigation scheme quietly bled dry.
The entire debate has operated within a frame that treats ecological overshoot as something we might still choose to avoid. We have already chosen it. The question is whether we can metabolize that fact. The high-yield varieties do not extract more energy from sunlight. They extract more biomass per unit of applied nitrogen. What looks like a biological revolution is, on closer inspection, a geological one. The synthesis of nitrogen fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process is among the most energy-intensive industrial operations humanity has ever scaled. We fed 1 billion people by eating oil. That is not a metaphor. It is an accounting identity that the yield figures do not show. Only sure, because yield figures measure outputs and leave the input columns blank. A firm that books revenue but never books depreciation looks solvent until the machinery stops. That is the financial structure of the Green Revolution's balance sheet. The epistemological problem is that this works until it stops. A system running on resource depletion does not send advance warnings that are legible to those inside it. Crop yields rise. Supermarkets stay stocked. Every signal says, continue. There is no flashing light that appears the siren before the phosphate mine grade falls below economic recovery or before the antibiotic-resistant root pathogen that monoculture has been quietly selecting for arrives in force across a continent's wheat belt. The Aral Sea did not announce its intentions. Soviet planners watched cotton yields climb for 2 decades while the basin's hydrology was being permanently rearranged. By the time the signal became undeniable, the sea was already a salt flat, and the fishing fleet was parked in desert sand. These are not exceptional failures. They are what resource drawdown looks like when the accounting is done in the wrong units. We have spent this debate examining whether innovation precedes its own unraveling, but the structure of that framing assumes a clean temporal sequence. Solution, then side effect. When the evidence suggests they are the same event unfolding at different velocities. The crisis we are managing now is not what comes after the Green Revolution. It is the Green Revolution, viewed from sufficient distance that its full metabolism becomes visible. The international plant breeding institutions codified genetic uniformity into global food supply at precisely the moment that diversity would have been most valuable as insurance. The 1970 southern cornleaf blight, which destroyed 15% of the American maize crop in a single season, was not a warning shot from outside the system. It was the system expressing its own internal logic. The test of whether we can see this from inside is not whether we can describe the mechanism. We just did for an hour. The test is whether describing it changes what happens next. On that measure, the answer is already in. We see it clearly. We continue anyway. That is not ignorance. That is the behavior of a system that has discovered it cannot afford to stop.